So today we're going to talk about managing change using Stemmons Enterprise. As people often point out, the technology is awesome, but it's really lives or dies based on how we introduce it to an organization. And I'm going to run through some very tried and true tested strategies today to make it work introducing the system into a company. So the first thing is there are 4 basic categories of things that we want to think about when we're dealing with organizational change. The first is the structure and design of what we're implementing. The second is the order in which we do things. The third is our management and culture. And then finally, we have the issue of working with people, kind of the soft skills. So each one of these has a number of strategies that we're going to cover. First of all, structure and design. So we want to think about what work is. And there's kind of a new approach to work these days when we have access to tools like Stemmons, where we can divide work that used to be done by one person into a group of things. So we have these different portions of activity that get done. On one hand, you have a decision architect. This is somebody whose responsibility it is to figure out what's the problem, what data do we need to support that decision, how can we get that into the form of a report, maybe structure and analysis. And this is in some ways the highest calling of work that someone is doing because it's putting together the architecture of our decision-making process. Once that's done, an analyst can take over and execute on that analysis and then give the results of it to somebody who's actually going to implement or do the work. So typically this is a manager of some kind, and they receive the output of an analytics process, and then they make a decision based on that. And it's important that we think about setting up our organization this way, where we have these different skill sets clearly defined, as opposed to just assuming that one person can do all of that stuff together, because typically most people can't. So in order to do that, we need certain kinds of people, right? We used to think of these people as geeks. This is from Revenge of the Nerds, one of my favorite movies from the 80s. But it's not just geeks, is we need the cool geeks. We need people who really understand data, who understand analytics, but who also are excited about the business and about making things better. And if we can find those people and bring them into the organization, we've now structured our team in a way that makes sense. Okay? And without that, everyone's going to be looking around wondering whose job is it to create this decision architecture, who's going to create the analysis, who's going to make sure that these things are getting done. So we need to find the right kinds of people for the organization, whether we bring them in from outside or whether we identify people internally, doesn't really matter, but we have to make sure we've got the right structure for our team. The next thing is to create what we think of as centers of excellence, right? Most people with their existing job descriptions, they have work that they're supposed to be doing, but are they thinking about kind of the larger picture? Are they thinking about how their work fits in across the organization, maybe between different silos or between different departments? So what we can do is create and structure a center of excellence that brings people together around a given concept. Maybe it's customer service, maybe it's analytics, and have people from different parts of the organization come together in essentially a cross-functional virtual team. And we find that by doing that, we start knitting together these different groups within the organization and giving them a sense of purpose and a sense of focus. But if we don't formalize that, then it's nobody's job really. And nobody thinks that it's their responsibility to stand up and do something that's going to make a change in one of those areas that's fundamental to the company. What we also look for are common tools. This is a really cool kind of bracelet that you can wear, and you can undo it at any point, and it's a screwdriver and a wrench and a bottle opener, and it's all different kinds of things, and it looks pretty cool too. But the idea is that it's one thing that we can use for a variety of purposes, and that, of course, is what Stemmons Enterprise is all about, because it's a common set of tools that can be deployed in many different cases around the organization. But that helps a lot because the commonality of the tools makes it much easier for people to adapt to try new things, to change the way they're working, because it's not a new tool or a new system to learn every time, right? If they learn a set of common tools that they can use anywhere, then that becomes very valuable because it just reduces the barriers to entry for any kind of change that we're trying to introduce into the organization. Okay, agility, this is from a little YouTube video, and you can kind of guess what happens here is, you know, the big guy looks like he's going to crush the little guy, but the little guy runs around, and he's very nimble, and eventually the big guy gets tired and the little guy wins. And the point is that, you know, if we're trying to make change, we're going to do better by being agile. We're going to do better by being nimble, by having small steps, by moving quickly, by adapting, as opposed to trying to lift a big, huge project that will, you know, potentially run out of steam or fail at the end. We're going to talk more about agility because it's critical. So the bottom line here represents kind of the traditional waterfall approach to developing software, to implementing projects, to launching initiatives where you spend a lot of time kind of getting the requirements, you spend a lot of time with design, you spend a lot of time in development, and then the launch and kind of the rollout is also big. And the problem with that kind of approach is that you often don't realize until way down the road that either the underlying conditions have changed, or you've missed something, or it's not going to be adopted, and then you have a big failure on your hands, and it, you know, everybody's upset, and it really chills the appetite for more change. So what we do instead is we kind of follow this agile approach. This came from software development. It's all about sprints. It's all about much shorter cycles. Is we're just doing as much as we can to get to the next reasonable point where we can stop, determine whether what we did was useful, and plan the next sprint. Okay, so this is a different way of working. It's all about tiny little incremental steps, and the effect is kind of like, you know, when you see a child that you haven't seen for a while, and you realize, wow, they're so much bigger. But if you're with that child every day, you almost don't notice the growth because it's so incremental. So the structure of the things, the projects, the initiatives that we're trying to put in place, if they're small bites, if they're incremental, if they're agile, then we're going to almost inevitably avoid big failures, be more adaptive to what the organization needs, and make better progress and avoid those calamities that kind of, you know, ruin everything downstream. Now we're into design. Okay, so this is one of the things that is just part of human nature. Is people like things to be somewhat similar. They don't want to have too much surprising change at once. This is a push-button phone that came out right around the time that rotary phones were going away, right? And it still has the dial shape, but we're not spinning a dial anymore. We're pushing the buttons. But for somebody who didn't want or wasn't ready for or was resistant to change, the familiarity in the design is very important. So even if we're replacing an old system, we might want to keep the look and feel. If we have certain language in the old system that we don't really need anymore, but maybe we can keep it and have some continuity for people that are experiencing something different, that's wonderful. Very often we'll change the back end of something, and we'll leave the front end looking almost the same, even though it might look a little dated, and then later you know, start making those design changes incrementally in a way that's visible. So we want to leverage the familiarity, and that way people feel like it's a continuous path. This is one of my favorite things to notice out and about. It's called a desire path, and we've all seen this. It's where the architect thought that something should happen, but the actual users are following a different path. Okay, and I love noticing these because it always shows me and reminds me that the design that we have in mind is not necessarily the design that the users want. And there are times and there are reasons where we should have the design kind of push somebody in a particular place, maybe for safety, maybe for some kind of compliance requirement. But generally speaking, the more we're ignoring the desire of the users, the less success we're going to have with adoption. So we want to look for those kinds of things and welcome them and embrace them as opposed to try to fight against them. If in a situation like this, you might have somebody putting up a sign that says, don't step on the grass, or putting up a barrier or a chain or something, and in fact, really probably the best thing to do is to pave that little path so that people can not get mud on their shoes and it can respect the desires of the users. Data visualizations. This is something that is, underappreciated, I think. This is a very poor data visualization, right? And when we're moving into a world of being data-driven and having decision architecture and making decisions by looking at information, we have to pay a lot of attention to the way we show those things. If someone is going crazy with pie charts and three-dimensional things and stuff that distorts information, then it's almost worse than having nothing at all. Because some very bad decisions can be made by the way that the data is presented. So this is another thing back to kind of structure of the team, is we want to have somebody on board who really cares about data visualization and who cares about showing things in a way that makes sense, that can actually put the information in a format where we can make a decision. If we don't have somebody like that in the team, let's be honest about it. Instead of pretending that we're good at it, or pretending that having a bunch of charts and graphs and stuff is actually the same as having an artifact that will help us make a better decision. If we want to get good at that kind of stuff, there's some great resources out there. A few that I would point out. Thomas Davenport has some excellent work on analytics, and now artificial intelligence is kind of what he's been focusing on recently, but even his stuff from the last cycle was awesome. Edward Tufte is the grandfather of data visualization, and his books are tremendous. He's also got seminars and so forth. And Stephen Few is a very well-respected person. His books on dashboard design and those kinds of things are very, very, very valuable. So it's worth investing if you have someone that you're training, or if you're finding someone, is put this content in front of them, have them read it, do it as a working session, do it as a book club. But it's one of those things that people don't really realize sometimes how critical it is, but if we get it right, then we're going to be in much better shape. So now I'm going to talk about part 2 of driving change in an organization, and this has to do with the order in which things happen. When we learned math, right, we had to learn geometry first, and then trigonometry, and then pre-algebra and algebra, and pre-calculus, and finally calculus. And you wouldn't take, boy, I hope I got the order right. You wouldn't take a kid in 9th grade and put them in front of a calculus textbook and expect them to understand. If we do things progressively in a well thought out order, then it's going to make a huge difference. So here are some of the things that we want to do in the order that we want to do them. The very first thing has to do with developing a common language. So this is a picture for those of you who know the story of the Tower of Babel. I'm sure I'm going to get it a little bit wrong, not being a biblical scholar or anything, but the general gist of it was that everybody was building this tower together, and it was going to reach the heavens, and somebody upstairs was upset about that and decided to frustrate those ambitions by causing everybody to speak different languages, with the understanding that if everybody were speaking different languages, they would not be able to work together and reach those heights. And that's true in business as well. In an organization, if different departments, if different business units are using different language for things, then we're not gonna really get very far. Right, so what we're looking for here is a common enterprise taxonomy. This is a way of describing everything in the organization in a structured way, preferably where we have a single version of the truth. We have a system of record for key data elements, and other groups, other business processes consume that information from the system of record instead of holding it in parallel. There's a lot of information architecture that goes into this. What are the relationship between different data elements? And you have to be one of those cool geeks, I think, to really get into this. A lot of people, especially if they haven't been focused on data, if they haven't been working in a unified environment, will frankly not care about this that much. And companies that really get it right spend a lot of time and effort focusing on enterprise taxonomy up front, because it becomes the foundation for everything that comes after. And if we get it right, we can do some very, very cool things. So that's always step one. We don't always get to focus on it as much as we want to because of organizational inertia and kind of lack of attention to it. But the companies that we come into where they're focusing on that, they just have a much better foundation to grow on. The next thing we want to think about is, where do we start, right? Low-hanging fruit. So we've spent a lot of time and energy kind of trying to reach things that are too high up in the tree to start. Again, this has to do with the idea of building on successes and being incremental. So we want to start with things that are low risk, right? That are high visibility. Things where we're not trying to bump out an existing system. Maybe projects where we don't need to train too many people to do too many different things versus what they're currently doing. And if we find those low-hanging fruits, if we find those things that are going to be easy, that are going to teach us some basic skills, that are going to be visible to the organization, then we create a springboard. We create some success that we can build on. The worst thing is when we aim too high in the beginning. We might try to focus on something that requires too much change, too many new skills. Maybe there's something that we're trying to bump out that's already there. So we're going to have some resistance from people in the organization, and sometimes it can feel a little bit frustrating because we want to go for that big win. We want to go for that brass ring, and instead we're saying, hey, let's take a little time and do some basics first. But it ends up being a much faster path to success to pick the right initial projects, even though they may not be the ones that feel the highest yield right away. So we do those ones first. Another thing we see very often, this is the house from that movie, I think that inspired that movie Up. They were building this big shopping mall, and there was a woman who didn't want to leave her home. And although they tried and tried, they couldn't get her to budge, and they ended up just building around her. And that's a good lesson, right? There will be people in an organization who don't really want to change. And sometimes those will be key people in the organization who are major stakeholders, who are influential in the organization. And there's often a desire to say, okay, we're gonna go for that person, because if we convince him or her to get on board, then everybody else will follow. Personally, I think that's a mistake. Okay, I think that typically those people who are resistant to change, who don't want to try something new or who don't want to be first, we should let them be. There's typically other opportunities in the organization, and if someone doesn't want to participate in the early versions of things, then we're not going to have success with them anyway. And the more we go after them, and the more we try to convince them, the more we empower their resistance. And it's not. I mean, they may have very good reasons to not want to change. What we've found works much better is to just leave them be, right? We work around those people. We let them keep doing what they're doing. Don't try to change them, and build some successes in other places and other areas where we have a more engaged and excited group of people. Eventually, that person or people who were resistant will see the success and come around and kind of be much more interested in participating. But the idea that we're going to crack that tough nut first and everything else will follow, not the right order in my experience. As we look at the processes that we're building. Sometimes there's a desire to do parts of a project and then move on to a part of another project. Instead, we want to make sure we finish the entire thing. So we call this building the arch, or making a self-sustaining process. And this is a freestanding arch. I think it's in Wichita, and it's a good kind of lesson or metaphor for the types of processes that we want to build and how we want to make sure to finish each one before moving on to the next. So this is them kind of planning the arch. They build a support structure, okay, and then they have these specially cut pieces of stone that come, and they put them on one by one, and the support structure is holding up the whole thing. And eventually, the last piece, the keystone, gets put into place, and then and only then can they remove the arch, and the structure holds itself up. So that support structure could be you in an organization. If you're building a process, you're the one that's holding it up, and we're configuring it in Stemmons. Okay, we're building out all the pieces, and eventually we get to a point where we have a self-sustaining infrastructure, a self-sustaining process that will continue on its own. And if we do that, then we have something that will be there for a long time, and you're not going to get tired being the support. Because if we build only part of a process, you're holding it up, you get busy with something else, the process kind of dies, then everyone is looking at it and saying, well, what's all this work that we did? Let's not try that again. Okay? So if you leave it there, there's a little tree I think you can see in there, and the arch will be there for a long time as the tree grows. Okay, management and culture. Kind of this is about the nature of your organization, right? And if we get the culture right, then we're going to be in much better shape. The first thing I'd say is we use this example of a parking lot sometimes. And a parking lot is interesting because you have people kind of coming in and out and driving their cars, which can be very dangerous and very valuable. And if it's not done right, then the parking lot, like if we don't have lines, the parking lot can kind of look like this, right? And it's not helpful. So someone has to kind of say, hey, are people following the instructions? Are they parking within the lines? Or put another way is, are they using the system effectively? And what happens is, if let's say someone doesn't park the correct way, right? There's a few stages that we go through. The first thing, is we might write a very nice note. Excuse me, sir, ma'am, please remember that we don't want to block the fire lane. Would you mind parking? I mean, we can be very polite about it. If it continues, we can be a little bit less polite, and a little more pointed. It's like, look, you're not doing this the way that we need you to. And this might be someone who's putting bad data into the system, or following up with things outside of the system, or not being a good data steward, or not using the information that's in the system to make decisions. And there's a path of escalation here. The next is, when someone is really being a jerk about it, right? And now we're not really mincing words. And of course, at the end of the day, the last resort is to just remove the offender. And this is really not where we want to be. Is if we're just towing people from the parking lot, it probably means that the lines are not clearly marked. It means that we haven't explained to people why it's important that we don't block the access and take up too many spots. We haven't called out to them their activities. So we don't want to go right to that. But there are times when we have to, we have to be in that mode. The information that's in our system is important to the organization, okay? But we also have to use it in order to make it important, right? So, we have a structure of information. We have hung from it kind of all these strands of data, and now that data is there for us to use. So if we have a meeting and we're talking about how things are going, and we're not looking at that data in the meeting, then we're not really using it. We're not making it important, and we're sending, first of all, the signal that we don't really care. And second of all, we're probably making bad decisions based on limited information, based on gut feelings, that kind of stuff. And so as soon as we start having that infrastructure and having that data, we want to start using it in our conversations. We think about it this way, is if we're having a conversation about something and we have data about that thing and we're not looking at the data while we're having the conversation, then we're missing an opportunity. And if we do that too many times in a row, then like I said, we're sending the wrong message and we're undermining the success of our own system. So as soon as we stand up a use case that drives or generates data about our operations or our activities, then we want to start using that data immediately and consistently. Because if we don't, we're going to wander off course. When we talk about managing people, okay, remember that there's a lot of things that go into kind of the results that somebody has. For example, if you're a salesperson and you're selling a product, your sales of the product might be related to your personal activities, but it might also be related to whether or not there was a competitor. Maybe a competitor rolled out a new product that's better, or maybe they undercut our price, or maybe our major customer went bankrupt, or who knows, right? These are things that are beyond that person's control. So we look at someone's activities and say there are things that they can control, there are things that they can't control. That, and in this case, we're talking about leasing. So if this was a real estate leasing agent, those things combine to make the results. And what often happens is people are measured on those results. What we would really like to do is change that and have the measurement come only from the things that people can actually control. Okay, this is possible using Stemmons in a way that it often wasn't before. And so if we can isolate the performance metrics to things that are actually within that person's control, then we do a much better job of incentivizing their behavior. Data governance. Data governance is another one of those things like enterprise taxonomy that is somewhat underappreciated. But the truth is, if we're using information to make decisions, if we're asking people to rely on information, then we have to have processes to make sure that that information is maintained in an appropriate way. Okay, data governance is a series of policies and procedures designed to make sure that information is complete, accurate, and up to date. Okay, and it could be something as simple as how do we manage our email list. It could be something much more complicated, that is very nuanced and specific to your industry. But the point is, if we have information and we're not maintaining it and we're not applying some governance to it, then it will become bad. And bad information is worse than no information, because what happens is people learn that they can't trust it. And as soon as they learn that they can't trust it, all the effort that they make to contribute to it and maintain it is somewhat for waste, because they have still another process they have to do, which is to check things manually or to ask people or to use other methods than just relying on the data. So this is kind of one of those things that, when we didn't have data or when we weren't using data in a collaborative, universal way, we didn't need data governance. Kind of like before we had computers, we didn't need computer technicians. Now we have data and we need people and processes to govern that data. And in many cases, it's justifying starting a new position, starting a new department, investing time and effort in the quality of the data, because it does make a huge difference for adoption. We also want to make sure that we're scientific about the way we do things. If we have a decision-making process that has data involved, we want to determine what is the experiment, how do we measure the results, and what is the conclusion that we can draw from that. If we have information and we've gone through all the trouble to design the decision-making process and have good data and all of that, and then we just throw out the results and do whatever somebody decides is right, then we're not being scientific. We're pretending to be scientific, and that doesn't really help. One of the nice things about being scientific is that we can try things. Okay, we can experiment. And we don't always know where those experiments are going to go. Skunkworks is, typically kind of a group that is trying somewhat out-of-the-box things. And, if we can structure the pilot properly, if we can decide what is going to constitute a go or a no-go with a given thing that we're trying, if we're doing it in an agile way that doesn't require making a huge investment in something, then we can try these kinds of things, and very often it will take us in small steps, but in unexpected directions that will help us differentiate ourselves from our competitors. There's a piece of writing out there called the Agile Manifesto, very influential, at least on our thinking. It has to do with kind of how we work together and how we iterate on things. I won't spoil the whole conversation, but it's easy to find, easy to read, and one of the byproducts of that is this concept of Scrum, which is kind of a stylized meeting that we do, and we tend to do it not just in the context of information technology, but also in general management things. And you can do this using Stemmons to support the Scrum methodology, because we can understand what people are working on, how things are going. We can iterate and keep track very easily of where every little mini project is. So this whole concept of taking the agile approach of software development and applying it outside of that context is a huge driver of change, and it helps us make sure that we don't have big failures. Okay, the last portion of this issue about managing change has to do with dealing with people. Okay, these are the soft skills. These are things that will make a difference that have nothing to do necessarily with data or technology or structure. If anybody remembers this scene from Star Wars, it's when he says, "These are not the droids you're looking for," and the guy just says, "These are not the droids we're looking for." It doesn't really work that way in real life. We don't have the Force, right? But what we do have is a series of things that we can do, right? A series of strategies or techniques, and if we do enough of those things, then we're going to have that kind of experience. So the first thing is to understand kind of who we're talking to, right? On one end of the spectrum, you have someone like the CEO, and going all the way down to someone who's an individual contributor. And these people are kind of coming into the conversation, and they have different areas of focus. So, we think of it as their landing zone. The CEO is mostly thinking about the vision and the strategy and the overall arc of the company. And then we start getting into skills and character. You've got someone who's running a department. They want to know what kinds of things do we need to be good at. And then finally, when we talk to someone who owns a process or who's an individual contributor in something, they're really focused on tactics. Like, what is the specific thing that we're doing? And we want to first of all engage with people in the area that they find interesting and important. Is if we start talking to a CEO about specific micro tactical issues, we're going to lose them. Okay, if we're talking to an individual contributor and we lead with where the company is going to be in 10 years, we might lose that person as well. So what we want to do is have these conversations with people in areas that are interesting to them, and create a chain. Basically, is knit together people and build a little coalition. Hopefully up and down the entire chain. This is kind of interesting. These are those game shows that you see where they're kind of running and they're going through all the obstacles, and then they think they're in the clear, and like some big fist comes popping out of the wall and knocks them into the water. This is what happens with transformation sometimes. Is we think we've gone through all the hard stuff, we've implemented our systems, we've created our data, we've trained everybody, and you think you're in the clear, and in fact, there's many things that still have to happen, and many things that can pop out and surprise us, and we need to be ready for those kinds of things. So this is a picture that was getting very upset about buses. Right? And it was talking about how much better horse-drawn transportation is. Now, we all know, I would like to think we know, that the advent of the automobile and buses for that matter have radically improved society, right? But there were people who were very upset and who were advocating for a ban on buses because horses are better, okay? People don't always like change, and we have to remember that those kind of people will be there, and we have to be aware of them and understand that it's not that they're bad people, it's that it's part of human nature is to be resistant to change, and we have to do our best to plan for that and to anticipate it and to work with it as opposed to just trying to ignore it or overcome it. The interesting thing is that there's not necessarily a direct correlation between the way that people act when they're in their normal kind of unstressed, at ease state and when they're under stress, okay? So it's kind of like the chocolates. Like you don't know what's going to be inside until you actually open it up. Somebody who is very easygoing and just very open under stress might become aggressive or might become evasive or might someone who's normally outgoing and seems like they can kind of handle anything might become withdrawn under stress. So don't be surprised if you're dealing with somebody and a change issue comes up and one of those obstacles is there and they're getting pushed into the water figuratively, hopefully not literally, and you get a reaction that is out of character for what you would expect from that person. That happens all the time, and we just have to understand that when we have somebody who is being asked to change or feels like they're being forced to change, it might bring up another part of their personality that we're not ready for. Being very smart and being very charismatic are both very important things if you're a leader of change in an organization. It's great, if we could all be Einstein and this was young Bieber. I don't know what he's up to now, but he was pretty charismatic, I guess. Maybe we just need crazy hair. I don't know. But these things are important, but they're not enough, right? We have to do more in order to be an effective agent of change. So normally I ask, does anybody know who this is? I'm going to just tell you. This is Dale Carnegie, okay, and he wrote this book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. And this is one of the most popular nonfiction books. I don't know how many copies, how many languages, but it's a lot and a lot. And basically, if you've ever been exposed to the book, what it is it's a series of suggestions of things that you can do, and none of them are particularly earth-shattering. You read it and you go, yeah, I kind of knew that, but sure enough, if you go and you try those things, if you do each of those things, then what do you know? People are more responsive and you have more friends. So there's some of that goes on here as well. Here are some of the things that fall into that kind of category for us. One is watch out for messages that you don't realize that you're sending, okay? This is showing how two sound waves merge together to create one that's actually carrying two signals at the same time. So I could walk into someone's office and say, I've got great news. We've got this awesome system that's going to help you make your life better. It's going to make things a lot easier for you. And the unintended signal that I might be sending is what you're doing is not correct, right? You've been doing things wrong. You're going to have to learn something new, and you may not learn it. You may not be able to. And if you are not able to learn it, you might be out of a job, right? That's the kind of thing that sometimes comes across, even though you're meaning to send a very positive, helpful message. So we have to really watch the unintended signals that we're sending, even as we're trying to be helpful. Context is important. This is people do care about the thing that's right in front of them, but it does help to kind of let them know how it all fits together. Okay, so we tend to kind of start with something that's particularly interesting to that person, but also expand the picture so they have a sense of the entirety of what we're discussing and why this is important and how it relates to other business processes, other people in the organization, maybe how it relates to our organization in the industry. But providing that context, whether it's upstream or downstream, is critical. This is Patty Hearst, okay, the media heiress who was abducted by the Symbionese Liberation Army, I think it was. And this is a picture of her robbing a bank with her captors. Okay, now I'm not suggesting that we go rob banks, but I think it's very interesting to understand that if we're trying to make change, we can get people on board with us. Okay, we can have them be part of the movement. We can have them be excited about what they're doing, and instead of being resistant, we can get them to be passionate advocates for what we're doing by finding those people that are interested, that are aware, that are susceptible to change, and then getting them to be part of the process. Maybe this is a bad example. I don't know. I'm getting some funny expressions in the audience. Okay. Also another bad example, because this is Leonardo DiCaprio in the Titanic. So remember, he was, I'm king of the world, right? Of course, the ship sank, but I'm not going to focus on that part. The idea is that we want to create heroes, right? We want to let somebody feel like they are making this happen, even if there's been 50 other people involved in the project, even if, like in this case, he's just happens to be in the front of the ship, but there's a bunch of guys in the in the engine room shoveling coal into a furnace, and they're necessary. But sometimes it's great to just have somebody have that feeling of exhilaration and being a hero. And if we can create those moments for people, then they're going to be on our team. This is the bus from the Merry Pranksters, another in my string of bad examples, because they were driving around the country giving people LSD, but nonetheless very impactful on our culture. This concept of this bus was, they would say, are you on the bus or are you not on the bus? Okay, this was made famous in a Tom Wolfe book called The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test. And what we're getting at here is that if people are on board, then they're part of something, and they're changing things. They're changing culture. They're opening people's eyes. They're ushering in a new way of doing business. The bus was called Further, right? So the idea was, if you're on the bus, then you can go further. And if we do these strategies, or if we do enough of them, we don't do everything all the time, we're not perfect, but if we do enough of these strategies with the people, we're going to get people on the bus. If we combine it with all the other things we've talked about with organizational change, then we're going to have a deep and meaningful impact on the way our business and our organizations are run.